She came for the summer, and she told herself she would leave it exactly as she found it. Clara Whitfield had driven the 2 hours from Philadelphia on a Tuesday morning in early June, her small sedan loaded with a duffel bag, 3 research notebooks, a voice recorder she wasn't sure she'd have the nerve to use, and a folder of printed correspondence from the Stoltzfus family confirming the arrangement. She had the address. She had the academic framework. She had a chapter outline for the dissertation, and a list of interview questions she'd spent the better part of April refining. What she did not have, she would later understand, was any real idea of what she was driving toward. Lancaster County received her the way it always received people who came from somewhere louder. It did not announce itself. The highway simply loosened, the strip malls thinned, and then without ceremony the land opened up on both sides of the road in long, rolling fields, the kind of green that has no adequate name in the vocabulary of cities. She passed a black buggy moving at a steady pace along the shoulder, a man in a straw hat holding the lines with the ease of long habit, and she slowed without thinking, the way you slow for something you recognize but can't quite place. The Stoltzfus farm sat at the end of a gravel lane off a county road between Strasburg and Bird in Hand. She found it by the mailbox, a plain metal rectangle with the name hand-lettered in black, and she pulled in and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening. There were birds. There was wind moving through the high corn to her left, still young and bright in early June. There was the particular silence that is not actually silence, but the absence of engines, of screens, of the low electrical hum she had lived inside her entire life, without once noticing it until it was gone. Katie Stoltzfus came out of the house before Clara had finished climbing out of the car. She was a compact, unhurried woman in her late 40s, her brown dress and white prayer cap worn with the ease of clothing that has never been thought about. And she extended her hand and said, "You found us fine then," which was not quite a question. Her husband Amos came around from the side of the house a moment later, hat in hand, and nodded in a way that communicated welcome without requiring a great deal of fuss about it. They were not unfriendly. They were simply people for whom efficiency of gesture was a matter of long practice. Clara's room was on the second floor of the farmhouse, small and whitewashed, with a window that looked out over the east side of the property. There was a wooden chair, a nightstand, a lamp on a cord, and on the bed a quilt so carefully made that Clara stood looking at it for a moment before she set her bag down. It was pieced in 2 colors, a warm cream and a faded blue, in a pattern of interlocking curved shapes that repeated across the whole surface like a conversation in fabric, each unit answering the one beside it. She did not know its name. She ran her fingers along one seam, feeling the even stitches, and then she unpacked her notebooks and set them on the nightstand and told herself she was here to work. Dinner that first evening was simple and generous, the way meals are when cooking is understood as a form of care rather than a task. After they ate, Amos took her briefly around the near fields while the light was still long, explaining the rotation, the crops, the way the kitchen garden was organized at the back of the house. Clara asked careful questions and wrote careful notes and behaved in every observable way like a person who was exactly where she intended to be, doing exactly what she had come to do. It was later, lying in the dark with the window open to the June air, that she noticed it. A light, amber and steady, in the building across the east field. A wood shop, she thought, or a barn with an attached workspace. It was too far to hear anything. The light simply sat there in the dark, patient and particular, and she watched it for longer than she meant to before she turned onto her side and closed her eyes. She did not write it in her notes. She wasn't sure why. The strawberries came in fast that year, the way they sometimes do when a warm, wet spring is followed by a sudden bright spell in early June. Katie had her own patch along the south fence, but strawberry picking in the community was often a shared affair. Neighbors moving between properties, the work done faster with more hands, and the labor repaid in kind at canning time or harvest. Clara had known this from her reading. She had not known what it would feel like to kneel in a row at 7 in the morning with her fingers going red and her back beginning to ache after the first 20 minutes, working alongside women who did not slow down and did not complain, and managed somehow to talk about entirely ordinary things while performing what was, by any honest measure, hard physical work. She was on her third quart basket when she heard the buggy come up the lane. Katie straightened and shielded her eyes and said, "Gut, the Beelers," with the particular satisfaction of a woman whose day is going according to a plan she has not shared with anyone else. Clara looked up. A man was climbing down from the buggy with the unhurried economy of motion she was beginning to recognize as a characteristic of people who did physical work all their lives, who had made peace with their own bodies a long time ago. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, his dark beard trimmed close, his straw hat casting a line of shadow across his face. A young woman came down after him, dark-haired and quick, already scanning the yard with eyes that moved differently than her father's, sharper at the edges. "Eli Baylor," Katie said by way of introduction when they'd come close, "and his Miriam. They're good neighbors. Eli, this is Clara Whitfield, the researcher I wrote you about." Eli Baylor looked at Clara with a directness that wasn't unfriendly and not particularly curious. It was simply honest. He said, "Welcome to Lancaster County," in a voice that was unhurried and a little lower than she'd expected, and extended his hand, and that was the whole of it. Miriam said hello with a pleasant, closed-off courtesy that told Clara very little, except that she was being assessed, which was fair enough. Clara was assessing too. They worked the rouse together for the better part of the morning. Clara found herself, without deciding to, watching Eli Baylor work. There was nothing dramatic about it. He picked strawberries the way he had presumably done everything, steadily and without waste of motion, talking with Amos when they were in the same row, quiet when they were not. Miriam worked beside her father or beside Katie, and once she helped Clara identify which fruit was ripe and which was not. A brief and practical instruction delivered without condescension, and Clara thanked her and Miriam nodded and moved on. By midday, the baskets were full, and everyone had come inside for the meal Katie had left simmering. Clara sat at the long table and ate and listened to the conversation move around her in a mixture of English and Pennsylvania Dutch, and tried to hold her notebook impulse down, because it was not the moment for a notebook, and she knew it. Eli said little at the table. When he did speak, it was direct and considered, and the other people at the table listened in a way that told her he was not a man who spoke to fill space. She watched his hands when he reached for the bread. A craftsman's hands, she noted, without quite noting it. That evening in her room, she opened her research notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date and a few observations about strawberry cultivation and communal labor practices. Then she sat for a while with her pen resting on the page. She looked at what she had written. She looked at what she hadn't. She wrote neighbor, farmer, furniture maker, widower, has a daughter, Miriam, approx. 19 to 20, recently baptized based on demeanor and the way the community speaks of her. She paused. She wrote. He listened the way some people read, like the words mattered and he intended to keep them. Then she closed the notebook, because that was not a research observation, and she was here to do research. The in-between Sundays had a different quality than the rest of the week, and it took Clara a few of them to understand why. There was no church service on alternating Sundays in the old order districts, the congregation rotating between homes, and the in-between Sundays belonged to rest and visiting, to the quiet sociality of people who spent the rest of their week in purposeful labor and understood the difference. Families gathered without great announcement. Children appeared in yards. The pace of the whole community seemed to drop a register, the way a piece of music does when it moves from one key to another. On the first in-between Sunday in late June, Clara sat on the porch of the Stoltzfus farmhouse with a glass of meadow tea and watched it happen. Buggies came and went. Women settled into the shade with handwork or conversation. Men gathered near the barn or walked the fields in the way that men who farm will always walk a field on their day off, because the field is never entirely separate from the person who tends it. Eli Byler arrived in the early afternoon with Miriam and stayed for several hours. Clara might have kept her careful distance the whole afternoon, but Katie, with the particular efficiency of a woman who does not believe in waste, brought Eli a glass of tea and said, without looking at either of them, "Sit a minute, Eli. Clara's been wanting to know more about the furniture work," which was not quite true, but was not quite false either. And so they sat. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, plainly and without performance. He made furniture in the shop attached to his barn, primarily tables and chairs and the occasional hope chest, sold through a local Amish-owned shop in Intercourse and occasionally by direct order. He had learned from his father, who had learned from his. The wood was mostly local hardwoods, oak and cherry and walnut. He did not use a great deal of ornamentation. The work was in the joinery, he said, in making something that would hold for 100 years and not announce itself about it. Clara asked questions. Not academic questions, not the questions from her list, but the questions that came from genuine curiosity, which are always different questions. And he answered them with equal straightforwardness. At some point, she became aware that they had been talking for longer than she had planned, and that the conversation had moved somewhere she hadn't quite tracked, from furniture to farming, to what it meant to know a piece of land so well that it was no longer a subject of study, but simply an extension of the self. She told him about her research then, about the dissertation, about what she was hoping to document and why she thought it mattered. She gave the answer she always gave, the one that was accurate and well-shaped and said everything she needed it to say. He listened the whole way through. Then he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet, deliberately, not absently, and he said, "What made you want to study it rather than do it?" She laughed a little quickly. "I'm a city person," she said. "I've spent my whole life in school." He nodded as though this answered something for him. She had the distinct and slightly uncomfortable feeling that it had not answered what he was actually asking. She moved the conversation on. He let her. When the Beelers left that evening, Clara stood on the porch and watched the buggy go down the lane and tried to remember the last time she had felt, mid-conversation, that she was being heard more carefully than she was hearing herself. She couldn't place it. She wasn't sure it had happened before. The barn raising was for a family named Yoder, 2 farms over from the Stoltzfus property, the Yoders having lost their old dairy barn to a fire in the spring. By 6 in the morning, there were already 30 men on the property, and by the time Clara arrived with Katie and the other women carrying food, the frame was going up in the particular organized way of a barn raising, which is one of those things that looks like controlled chaos from the outside and is, in fact, the opposite. Each man knowing his role, the work distributed by skill and experience with no foreman and no instructions visible to anyone who hasn't spent a lifetime learning the system. Clara stood at the edge of the yard and watched. She had read about barn raisings. She had seen photographs. Neither had prepared her for the physical fact of it, for the scale of the cooperative effort, for the sight of a building rising in real time from the labor of people who had shown up before sunrise because a neighbor needed a barn, and that was simply sufficient reason. She found Eli Byler in the frame about an hour in. He was working on the upper plate, high enough that she had to shield her eyes. He moved along the beam with a deliberateness that was, at that height, a form of quiet courage, and he fit the joint he was working on with the precision of someone who does not rush a thing that matters. Down below, he called something to a younger man, a correction or a measurement. She couldn't hear the words, and the younger man adjusted what he was doing and nodded. She watched for longer than she intended. There is a kind of person who doesn't need to be witnessed to know who they are. They do not perform their competence or their character. They do not look around to see if anyone is noting what they do. Clara had spent her entire academic life studying communities where identity was communal, where the individual understood herself in relation to the group, and she had written about it with precision and genuine interest. She had not expected to meet someone who simply was it, all the way down, without apparent effort or apparent thought. But before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from today? Because the people who find their way to a story like this one, I have found, are rarely listening by accident. They are sitting somewhere, a kitchen, a porch, a car on a long road, and they have chosen this particular story. And I think they know, on some level, what they are looking for. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. The day went long and the work went well, and by late afternoon, the frame was complete, and the community had fed itself on the food the women had brought, long tables under the trees, the kind of meal that appears without ceremony, because enough people work to make it appear. Clara helped serve and clear and found herself at the edge of the conversation more than in it, which was fine, which was where she needed to be. She was an observer. She had always been an observer. The light was going orange and long when she drifted to the edge of the property, following the fence line. It was a split-rail fence running along the east edge of the Yoder land, older than most of the structures on the farm, half overgrown with blackberry cane that would be heavy with fruit in another month. The cane was thick and green and slightly unruly along the rails, and beyond the fence the land dropped away into a woodlot, the trees deep green and still in the early evening. It was a threshold sort of place, she thought. Neither one thing nor another. She had been there perhaps 10 minutes when she heard footsteps in the grass behind her, and turned to find Eli Byler coming along the fence line from the south, his jacket off, checking the rails where the cane had pulled some of them loose. He saw her and slowed and said, "Sorry, didn't know anyone was here," which she understood wasn't an apology for his presence, but a courtesy for hers. "Don't stop on my account," she said. "I was just getting some air." He came to the fence a few yards from where she stood and tested a rail with both hands, found it loose, and made a note of it in some internal ledger she couldn't see. Then he stood with his hands resting on the top rail and looked out at the woodlot the way farmers look at land, as though reading something in it. "Good day's work," she said. "It was," he said. "The Yoders will be all right." She nodded. There was a pause, not uncomfortable. She had been in enough of his silences now to understand they were not a social failure, but simply the space he left for things to settle before he moved on. "It's remarkable," she said, "what I watched today. I've read about it dozens of times." "Reading about it and seeing it are different things," he said, not unkindly. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." Another pause. Below the fence, something moved in the woodlot, a deer or a large bird. gone before she could see it clearly. "You said you've been in school your whole life," he said. He was still looking at the woodlot, the studying, the researching. Is that what you always wanted, or is that just what happened? It was the question from the in-between Sunday, she realized. He had come back to it without making a point of returning to it, the way a careful person will without announcement. Return to the thing that wasn't answered. She opened her mouth and felt the careful answer waiting there, the shaped and accurate answer, the one that said everything it needed to say and kept everything where she had put it. She was good at that answer. She had been giving it her whole adult life. She said it. She heard herself say it. He turned his head and looked at her then, just briefly with that direct and honest look, and she had the absolute certainty that he had heard both answers, the one she'd given and the one underneath it, and that he was not going to press her on it, and that he did not need to, because he had heard it, and she had heard herself give it. And that was enough for now. "Good night, Clara," he said, and moved on down the fence line, testing the next rail. "Good night," she said. She stood at the fence for a while after he had gone. The woodlot was still and the blackberry cane was dark against the last light, and somewhere across the fields a horse moved in a pasture, its shape just visible in the dusk. She thought about the answer she had given. She thought about the one she hadn't. She walked back to find Katie, and the drive home was quiet, and she did not write anything in her notebook that night. But her window was open, and the night air was warm and still, and when she finally lay down, she looked out at the dark shape of Eli Byler's workshop across the east field and saw the amber glow of the lantern burning inside it, steady and unhurried. The way a fire burns when the person who lit it is not in any particular hurry for the night to end. She watched it for a long time. She did not leave it exactly as she found it. She never had. The canning season in Lancaster County runs through July and into August, and it is not a casual thing. It is the year's serious work rendered domestic, the labor of preservation, the business of making enough so that enough will last. Clara had understood this abstractly. By the second week of July, she understood it in her hands and her back, and the particular kind of tired that comes from standing over a canning kettle in a farm kitchen in midsummer heat. The jars lined up on the counter going from empty to full to sealed with a rhythm that felt, after enough days of it, almost like breathing. Katie ran her kitchen with the particular authority of a woman who has done this work since girlhood and doesn't need to think about it anymore, which meant she could talk and work simultaneously, and often did, sharing information about the community or the season or the history of a particular recipe, with the even, unhurried generosity of someone who does not hoard what she knows. Clara listened and took notes when she could, and helped when she was shown how, and made mistakes and corrected them, and gradually became useful in the small, specific ways that are available to someone who is learning a skill that takes years to master. Miriam came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. This had not been discussed with Clara. It was simply how it was. The first Tuesday, Miriam arrived at 7:30 with a flat of tomatoes from her father's kitchen garden and went directly to work without more than a polite acknowledgement of Clara's presence. And Clara went directly to work without more than a polite acknowledgement of hers, and they worked in the same kitchen for 4 hours and talked about almost nothing personal, and that was how it went. The second Tuesday was the same. And the Thursday. Clara was patient in the way she was patient with research, which is to say she observed without pressing, and she noted what she saw, and what she saw was this. Miriam Baylor was extremely competent, quick and precise and unsentimental about the work, and she was perfectly civil to Clara, in the way that a person is civil to someone they have decided to be civil to, as a matter of principle, rather than inclination. And underneath the civility, like a low current in a river that is smooth at the surface, there was wariness, not hostility. Wariness, the particular alertness of someone watching for something. By the third week, Clara had stopped pretending she didn't know what Miriam was watching for. She didn't try to address it. What was there to address? She was not doing anything. She was here to do research, and she was doing it. She helped with the canning, and she took her notes, and she had conversations with Eli Beeler that were not, by any standard she could apply, inappropriate. They were neighbors. They were people who saw each other at meals and over fence lines and at community events. There was nothing to address. She told herself this with some regularity. Still, she was honest enough to know that she noticed, every Tuesday and Thursday, whether Eli would come by the house in the afternoon when the canning was done, whether he would find some errand that brought him to the kitchen door. He did sometimes. He came for something specific, a jar of last year's apple butter that Katie was keeping for him, a length of rope Amos had borrowed and was returning through the house, some practical transaction that was complete in 3 minutes and left the kitchen feeling slightly different than it had before he arrived. Miriam noticed this too. Once, in early August, when the kitchen was hot and the work was almost done for the day, and they were both tired in the particular flattened way of a long afternoon's canning, Miriam said without looking up from the jar she was sealing, "You're writing a book about us." "A dissertation," Clara said, "about traditional agricultural and food preservation practices in old order Amish communities. It's academic, it's not meant to be intrusive." Miriam considered this. "Will people read it?" "Academics, mostly. People in my field. Will they understand what it's like, reading about it?" Clara looked at her. "No," she said. "Reading about it and seeing it are different things." She heard the echo of the words a half-second after she said them. Miriam didn't know where they came from, but the corner of her mouth moved almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, and she picked up the next jar, and the silence between them was, for the first time, a degree warmer than it had been. It was not friendship. It was not even the beginning of friendship, but it was something, a tiny renegotiation, a door not open but perhaps acknowledged, and Clara filed it carefully away in the part of herself that was not her notebook. August moved through its heat and its work, and the evenings began to come a little earlier, and the quality of the light changed in the way it does in late summer, going from the flat white noon light of July to something more golden and angled, the shadows longer. Clara walked in the evening sometimes, out along the field roads, and she thought about the dissertation, and she thought about Philadelphia, and she thought about what she was going home to in October, the apartment, the university, the shaped and purposeful life she had built. It was a good life. It was the life she had chosen. She did not doubt it. But there were evenings when she stood at her window and watched the lantern in Eli Baylor's workshop and felt something she did not have the right words for, something quieter than longing and more persistent than curiosity, and she understood standing there in the late August dark that she had stopped counting the days of the summer as days remaining. She was counting them as days that were happening. She wasn't sure when that had changed. She was sure it had. She came for the summer, and she had already stopped leaving it as she found it, and she had known it since the fence row, since the question she hadn't answered, since the lantern she had watched and not written down. She had known it, and she hadn't said it. And she wasn't sure yet what the saying of it would cost. The singing was held at the Lapp farm on the last Sunday of August, in the big sitting room with the furniture pushed back and the benches brought in. And Clara sat along the wall with Katie and a few of the older women and listened. She had attended a singing once before, years ago, during an undergraduate research trip, and she had written about it with the careful neutrality of someone taking field notes. She had described the acoustics, the song selection, the social function of the gathering for the community's young adults. She had written accurate sentences that had nothing in them of what it actually sounded like, which was this: like something old and unhurried rising out of the people who sang it, not performed but released. The slow German syllables of the Lob-Lied moving through the room the way water moves through limestone, finding every hollow. Miriam sat in the singers' section with the other young women, her back straight, her voice clear. Clara watched her without trying to. Miriam sang with the same quiet intensity she brought to canning, to the kitchen work, to everything. But here it was different because here, there was nowhere to put the attention except inward, and what Clara saw on Miriam Beeler's face while she sang was something she had not seen there before. It was peace, not the closed-off courtesy, not the careful wariness, just peace, plain and undecorated, the face of someone who knows exactly where she is and has chosen to be there. Clara looked at her own hands in her lap. She thought about choosing. After the singing, the young people moved outside into the warm night, and the older families began gathering their things, and Clara helped Katie with a dish she'd brought, and then drifted to the edge of the yard, where the light from the house reached the grass and then quit. The fields beyond were dark, and the stars were beginning to come out properly, the way they do in Lancaster County, without competition, dense and indifferent and beautiful. She heard Eli's step on the gravel before she saw him. He came around the side of the house with a lantern, the old kerosene one from his shop, which she recognized by its particular amber quality, a color she had learned from her window. He had it low in his hand, and he stopped when he saw her standing at the edge of the light. "Amos and Katie are nearly ready," he said. "I thought I'd walk back across the field. It's shorter than the road." "Yes," she said. "All right." He set the lantern down on a fence post while he settled his jacket. That movement, the deliberate setting down of the thing in his hands, before attending to something else. And she watched it and felt the word for it arrive in her mind without invitation. Readiness. He was getting ready to say something. They walked. The lantern made a small warm circle of the world, and beyond it the fields were dark and full of the sound of late summer insects, the katydids loud in the tree line. They did not talk for the first few minutes, and the silence was not uncomfortable. She had grown accustomed to his silences. She understood now that they were not absences. "You're not who you were in June," he said. They were halfway across the field, the Stoltzfus house lights visible ahead. She didn't answer immediately. She listened to the katydids. "No," she said. "I don't think I am." "It's the work," he said. "Real work changes people, not because it's hard, because it's honest." She thought about this. Is that why you do it? The farming, the furniture, because it's honest? "I do it because it's mine to do," he said. "But yeah, there's that too." She looked at the lights of the house ahead. "You're not who I expected either," she said. She said it quietly and evenly, the way you say a true thing when you have decided to say it, and not decided what to do with it after. He didn't answer that. She hadn't expected him to. They walked the rest of the field in silence, the lantern between them casting their shadows long behind them into the dark. And when they reached the edge of the Stoltzfus yard, he stopped and she stopped beside him, and for a moment they simply stood there. The house before them, the dark field behind, the night air warm and smelling of cut hay, and the end of summer. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, Eli," she said. He walked back into the field. She watched the lantern go, that small amber point of light moving through the dark, unhurried, steady, the way it had always moved, the way she had watched it from her window without admitting to herself that she was watching. It did not waver. It went on until the trees swallowed it, and then it was gone, and she stood there a moment longer in the dark before she went inside. She did not sleep well that night. She lay under the double wedding ring quilt and looked at the ceiling and listened to the farm settle around her and thought about the word honest, the way he had said it, plain and undefended, as though honesty were not a virtue you worked toward, but simply the ground you stood on, if you were standing anywhere, worth standing at all. She thought about the question she hadn't answered at the fence row in June. She thought about the answer that had been sitting underneath the careful one all summer, patient as bread on a windowsill, waiting for the warmth that would let it do what it needed to do. She was not, she understood, going to be able to leave this exactly as she found it. Council meeting came in mid-September, that season of communal self-examination the old order districts held each year in preparation for communion, a time when the congregation took stock of itself, when members met privately with the bishop to affirm their faithfulness to the Ordnung and to one another. Clara was not part of this, could not be, but she felt the change in the household's temperature, a quietness more deliberate than usual, a sense that the community was attending to something inward and important. Amos read more in the evenings. Katie's conversation was gentler and more careful. Even the farm seemed to hold itself differently. The harvest underway now, the corn being cut, the fields going from full to stubble in long, orderly rows. Eli Baylor went to speak with Bishop Reuben Zook on a Thursday morning. He had asked for the meeting himself. This was not unusual during council meeting season. What was unusual, and what the bishop would have noted with the attentiveness of a man who had been reading his congregation for 40 years, was what Eli brought to it. He sat in the bishop's kitchen, his hat on his knee, and he told the truth. He said that there was an Englisher woman staying at the Stoltzfus farm, which the bishop knew. He said that she was intelligent and honest, and that he had spent the summer being aware of her in the way that a man is aware of something that is not his, and that he has not decided what to do about that awareness. He did not dress it up or diminish it. He said it plainly, and then he was quiet. Bishop Zook was a tall man gone thin in his late 60s, with a white beard, and the particular stillness of someone who has spent a lifetime listening to people tell him things they have not told anyone else. He did not react to what Eli said with alarm or with censure. He listened the whole way through. Then he was quiet himself for a moment, and when he spoke, he asked a single question. "Is she asking the faith?" he said. "Or are you asking it for her?" Eli looked at him. "There's a difference," the bishop said, "between a woman who is finding her way towards something real and a man who wants her to find it so that things can work out the way he hopes they will. One is the Holy Spirit's business. The other is yours." Eli sat with that. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the bishop's wife was bringing in laundry from the line, her footsteps crossing the yard in the quiet afternoon. "I don't know which it is," Eli said. "No," the bishop said. "That's the honest answer." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm not telling you what to do, Eli. You're a grown man and a faithful member, and I trust your discernment. I'm saying, be sure whose question you're carrying. That's all." Eli drove home in the buggy along the county road and watched the fields go by, the corn stubble, the harvested ground, and he thought about Ruth. He thought about her the way he had learned to think about her over 3 years, not as an absence, but as a presence that had changed its form, the way water changes form and is still water. She had been a good woman and a faithful wife, and he had loved her with the steady, unremarkable love that comes from choosing the same person every day for years, which is the realest kind. She was gone. She was not coming back. He had known both of these things for 3 years, and he had made his peace with them, or something close enough to peace that it functioned the same way. What he had not known until this summer was that his heart had not made the same arrangements his head had made. His head had been very responsible about the whole thing. His heart had apparently been waiting for something and had not informed him of its intention to do so. He pulled into his lane and unhitched the horse and stood in the barn for a while after, his hand on the horse's neck, thinking about a woman who answered questions carefully and heard herself doing it. He went to his shop that evening and worked until late. The lantern burned. Miriam came on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of September. Clara was at the Stoltzfus house, which meant the kitchen was quiet when she arrived at her father's farm. And so Eli heard her step on the porch and the door, and looked up from the harness he was mending to find her in the doorway of the shop. She did not come in right away. She stood in the doorframe with her arms at her sides and looked at him with an expression he recognized from her childhood, from the particular way she had looked at him whenever she was about to say something she had been building up to say for a long time, and had finally decided she could not hold any longer. "Sit down, Miriam," he said. She came in and sat on the stool by the workbench. She looked at her hands, then she looked at him. "I've been watching," she said. "I know you have," he said. "The Englisher woman," she said. "Clara." "Yeah." "Dad." She stopped, started again. "Ma'am has been gone 3 years." "I know that," he said quietly. I'm not saying you can't." She pressed her lips together. "I'm not saying that. I know it's not wrong, too. But she's not. She's from Philadelphia, Dad. She has a whole life somewhere else. She came here for the summer and she's gonna leave. And then what? Then you're worse off than before. And the community is. And I'm." She stopped again. "And you," he said. She looked at the workbench. A long shaving of walnut wood lay curled near the plane, pale and thin. "Ma'am's not being forgotten," she said. And her voice had changed, had lost the argument in it, had gone down to what was underneath the argument, which was smaller and more frightened and entirely real. "I just need to know she's not being forgotten." He set the harness down. He did not answer right away. He looked at his daughter, this 19-year-old woman who had been 8 years old when he had taught her to braid a horse's tail, and 12 when she had beaten him at Scrabble for the first time, and 17 when her mother had gotten sick, and who had walked through all of it with a straightness of spine that sometimes made his chest ache with the weight of his admiration for her. "Your mother," he said carefully, "is in every piece of furniture I've made since she died. She is in this shop, in the smell of this wood, in the way I taught you to set a table, in the prayer we say before every meal. She's not going anywhere. She cannot be replaced. Nothing that happens for the rest of my life will mean she was loved less." He paused. "Do you hear me?" Miriam's jaw moved. She nodded once. "I don't know what this is yet," he said. "With Clara. I want to be honest with you about that. I haven't made it into something I can give you a clear answer about, because it isn't clear yet. And I won't lie to you and make it simple when it isn't simple." "What if she doesn't stay?" Miriam said. "What if she goes back to Philadelphia and that's the end of it and you're—" "Then I'll be the same as I was before," he said. "I've been alone before. I know how to do it." "I don't want you to have to know how to do it," she said, and her voice broke on the last word, just slightly. And then she pulled it back together with the same resolution she had always used to pull things back together, which was the resolution of a woman who had learned it from her mother. He stood up and crossed the shop and put his arms around her, and she let him. briefly, the way she had always allowed comfort briefly, and then stood back up straight on her own. She wiped her eyes with the side of her hand. "I'm not saying I'm not worried," she said. "I know," he said. I'll try," she said. "That's all I can say right now. I'll try." She left a few minutes later, her footsteps crossing the yard in the September dark, and he watched her go and then stood in the doorway of the shop for a long moment, looking at the night. Miriam didn't say she was ready. She said she would try. In a community built on plain speech and honest dealing, that distinction mattered more than most people outside it would understand. She had not given her blessing easily, because it was not an easy thing to give, and she had given it anyway, imperfectly and honestly, the way real things are usually given. There is a particular kind of courage in the grown child who chooses against fear to leave room for the parent to be human. It is not the courage of certainty. It is the harder kind. October came the way October comes in Lancaster County, like a resolution to an argument that has been going on all summer. The air suddenly decisive, the light dropping its angle, the fields going bare, and the tree lines going gold and red, and then, in the last week before the leaves fell, that particular color that has no name, a kind of burning amber that lasts 3 or 4 days, and then is gone. Clara's departure date was the 14th. She had known this since June. She had written it in her planner and in her notebook, and she had oriented her research schedule around it, 12 clean weeks from arrival to departure, more than enough time for the material she needed. She had flights of stairs to go back to, a university office with a window that faced a parking garage, a dissertation committee waiting for chapters, a life, well-made and purposeful, that had continued perfectly well in her absence, and that would receive her back without difficulty. She went to the East Fence Row on the morning of the 13th. She told herself it was because she wanted to see the cornfield without the corn, wanted to note what it looked like at harvest's end for her research, the bare stalks and the turned earth. This was not untrue. It was also not the whole truth, and she was becoming less willing to let the careful answer stand in for the real one. The fence row was different in October. The blackberry cane had gone red, a dark, almost purple red, the leaves turning and beginning to fall. The split rails were visible now where they had been hidden by summer growth. Beyond the fence, the woodlot stood thin and clear, the light coming through the trees in long, clean lines that had been impossible in July. You could see further. Everything that the summer's fullness had concealed was visible now. She had been there perhaps 5 minutes when she heard his step in the cut cornfield behind her. She did not turn right away. She looked at the bare woodlot and the red cane and the rails of the fence. She heard him come to stand a few feet from her and stop. His hands, when she turned to look, were empty. He was not carrying anything. He had not set anything down. "I thought you might be here," he said. "I thought you might come," she said. A crow moved through the woodlot, its call flat and carrying, and then it was gone into the trees, and the silence came back. "I spoke to Bishop Zook," he said, "in September." "I know," she said. "Katie told me there was a conversation." She paused. "She didn't tell me what was said." "He asked me a question," Eli said. "He asked whether you were asking the faith, or whether I was asking it for you." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a careful question. He's a careful man." He looked at the woodlot. "I've been trying to answer it honestly ever since." He paused. "The honest answer is that I don't know yet. I don't know what you're asking or what you're finding. I know what I observe. I know you've been different since August. I know you've been reading." She looked at him. "You know I've been reading?" "Amos said you asked him for some books. Old order history, The Confession of Dordrecht, the writings on Gelassenheit. He met her eyes. That's not research reading. That's different reading. She let out a breath. It made a small cloud in the cold October air. I don't know what I'm doing, she said. I want to be honest about that. I haven't made any decisions. I'm not doing anything for the wrong reasons. I need you to know that. I know that, he said. I'm not going to convert to be with you, she said. It came out plainly, the way things come out when you have rehearsed them so many times that they have gone past nervousness into something quieter. I won't do it that way. If there's ever anything real to say about what I believe, it has to be because I believe it, not because of how I feel about you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is exactly the right answer." She looked at him. He was looking at the woodlot, the bare trees, the light coming through. "What I feel," he said carefully, "I've been carrying since about the middle of June. I didn't name it for a long time because naming it made it something I had to do something about." He paused. "I'm naming it now. I'm not asking you anything. I'm not asking you to be something you're not, or to decide something you're not ready to decide. I'm just telling you it's true. It seems like the honest thing to do." She looked at the red cane along the fence, the bare rails, the long light through the October trees. "I'd like to come back," she said, "not as a researcher, just as myself. In the spring, maybe, or before." She paused. "If that's all right." "It's all right," he said. They stood at the fence row for a few more minutes without speaking. And it was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have said the thing that needed saying and are now simply standing in the same place. Which is enough for now. Which is more than enough. The crow called again from somewhere deeper in the woodlot. The wind moved through the red cane along the rails with a dry, papery sound, the sound of leaves that have done their work and are ready to let go. She drove away the next morning with her notebooks and her voice recorder and her duffel bag. The car packed the same as it had arrived, the research complete, the chapters well in hand. Katie and Amos stood on the porch, and Katie pressed a jar of apple butter into her hands and said, "You come back." Not as an invitation, but as a statement of fact, the way plain people state things they mean. Amos shook her hand and nodded in the way she had learned over 3 months meant more than it showed. She did not see Eli. She had not expected to. That was not how it would go. And she knew it. And it was right. She drove down the gravel lane and turned onto the county road and drove. The fields on either side were bare, and the tree lines were gold, and the sky was that particular October blue. That is the year's last extravagance before everything goes quiet and gray and turned inward for the winter. She thought about what Katie had said to her that morning in the kitchen when she had asked, finally, the question she had meant to ask since her first night in the guest room. She had asked about the quilt, the pattern, what it was called. Katie had looked at her with the quiet, clear-eyed look of a woman who had been waiting patiently for this particular question, and she had said simply, "Double wedding ring. It's an old pattern. You give it to someone when you want them to know they're welcome to come back." Clara had stood in the kitchen holding that for a moment. Then she had said thank you and finished packing. She had not cried until she was on the county road with the farm behind her and Lancaster County spread out around her in the October light. She cried briefly and then she stopped, because there was no grief in it. Not exactly. It was more like the feeling of a seam that is held. She had come for the summer. She was not sure anymore that she could leave it as she found it. She could not. She had known that since June. since a fence row, since a question she had answered badly and a lantern she had watched from a window, and a man who set things down before he spoke, because he understood that honesty deserves a moment of stillness before it is given to someone else. She was going back to Philadelphia, and she was going to sit with the books she had been reading, and she was going to be honest with herself about what she found there. And in the spring or before, she was going to drive down a gravel lane in Lancaster County and see what was waiting. She was not going to rush it. She was not going to perform it. She was going to let it be what it was and find out what that was. And that was the most honest plan she had ever made. The Amish have a word, Gelassenheit, a yielding, a letting go of the self's insistence on its own plan. Clara did not know yet whether that word would ever belong to her. She did not know what the coming months would show her when she sat with those books in her Philadelphia apartment, whether she would find something that rang true all the way down, or whether she would find that this was not her path and that she would have to find another way to be honest about what the summer had changed in her. She did not know what Eli Byler's life would look like in 5 years, or Miriam's, or her own. But she had stopped pretending the question wasn't there. She had stopped giving the careful answer when the real one was sitting right underneath it, patient as rising bread, waiting for the warmth to do its work. That is what the story is about in the end. Not the romance, though there is that. Not the community, though it matters, every inch of it. It is about the particular courage of stopping the performance of being unaffected when you are not. It is about two people who were both, in their different ways, very good at holding things carefully and who chose, in the end, to set them down. It is about a young woman who came for the summer and told herself she would leave it exactly as she found it, and found out that some places and some people do not allow that particular dishonesty. The ones that are worth it never do. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it waiting. Subscribe, and I'll see you next time.